Is the war on Yemen finally changing? The Houthis have been ramping up attacks on the Saudi-led coalition, both in Yemen and Saudi Arabia itself, while the Saudis' partner, the UAE, is gradually pulling out of Yemen and reaching out to Iran. So what now for the coalition, and is there any room for diplomacy? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Welcome to Inside Story. It has been more than 4 years since the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE launched a ferocious air campaign to remove Iranian-backed Houthi rebels from Yemen. The effect, as we know, has been devastating. Tens of thousands of civilians killed and as many as 85,000 children who may have starved to death. But there are two things going on right now which, just maybe, have the potential to change the course of the war. One is the increased ability of the Houthis to hit back. On Thursday, they claimed 2 major attacks against Saudi-Emirati-backed forces. First, medium-range ballistic missiles were fired at a base used by Emirati-trained forces in the port city of Aden. At least 36 people were killed, including a senior military commander. But they also fired a long-range missile across the Saudi Arabian border, targeting a military base in Dammam, the capital city of the oil-rich eastern region. So that's one element, but perhaps more significantly, in the long term at least, is the UAE drawing down its military presence in Yemen. That started a few weeks ago, and for the first time in 6 years, Emirati officials met an Iranian delegation in Tehran. This time they discussed the Strait of Hormuz and signed an agreement to strengthen cooperation on maritime border security. But really, the mere fact that they met in the first place is a significant step.
Our meeting was practical with the aim of coordinating between Iran and the UAE for border security. One of the important points we agreed on is to hold meetings between leaders of border guards from Iran and the UAE. We will also strengthen communication between our borders in emergency situations.
So is this a fracture in the coalition? Well, first of all, we should really define the coalition, because remember, there were actually 10 countries which joined the air campaign against the Houthi rebels back in March of 2015. They included most of the Gulf countries, as well as Egypt, Sudan and Malaysia. But really, the whole thing has been driven and executed by the Saudis and the Emiratis, who then removed Qatar from that coalition after the blockade was imposed 2 years ago. They've also been supported by the US, the UK, France, Turkey and Belgium, not official members of the alliance, but they've been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia despite international condemnation. And on the flip side, China, Russia and of course Iran have voiced their opposition to military action in Yemen. Beijing and Moscow have vetoed UN resolutions against Iran's military assistance to the Houthis. So that's the situation. Let's bring in our guests now. In Lancaster in the UK, we've got Simon Maybon, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Lancaster University. In Sana'a, Hussein al-Bukhaiti, a pro-Houthi journalist and Yemen affairs specialist. And in Beirut, it is Rami Khouri, a senior public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. I think the bulk of our discussion is going to be about the state of the coalition, the state of the war, the recent moves by the UAE. But I do want to deal with these attacks that we've seen from the Houthis most recently, and I think Hussein al-Bukhaiti is a good place to start in Sana'a. These are increasing, aren't they? These larger scale attacks, and particularly the attacks which actually go over the border into Saudi Arabia. How are they managing to do this?
Today, the Yemeni, the army spokesperson in Sana'a has released footage of the missile that has targeted at Dammam. It's called Burkan 3. It's one of the upgraded missile from the stockpile that previous Yemeni regime had from Russia or from North Korea. And this attack actually it was, I think, the farthest inside Saudi Arabia, and it target at Dammam, which is in the oil-rich area in Saudi Arabia. And I believe that this is a kind of a strong message to Saudi Arabia that that saying that your oil infrastructure is under our coverage, and as well to United Arab Emirates, which I believe is the same distant as at Dammam. And the other attack as well on the Saudi-backed forces in Aden. I believe we all have heard this news from United Arab Emirates that they are withdrawing. There was no official statement from United Arab Emirates, and I believe this will be the first withdrawal in history without releasing an official statement. It's just some kind of leaks United Arab Emirates sending to some media outlet, and I think they want by that is to stop any planned attack on United Arab Emirates. That's why this attack on Aden, on Al Jala base is as well a message to United Arab Emirates that is not about your existence in Yemen. You have formed many militia, recruiting many Yemenis in the south, and those bases are actually used to fight Yemeni army and popular committee who are loyal to Sana'a. That's why all United Arab Emirates or other group under them, they will be under attack.
Hussein, would you go as far to say that the Houthis are turning the tables, are succeeding almost against the UAE and Saudi Arabia?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you see the course of war, in the first 3 weeks, the former spokesperson of the coalition, Al-Asiri, he said that they have destroyed most of what he called at the time Houthi weapons, especially missiles. But now we see that Yemeni army actually is upgrading new missile. They are copying some of the missiles that they have. They are making new drones that have reached to United Arab Emirates and many areas in Saudi Arabia. And still Saudi Arabia, with all the weapons, with all the Patriot, latest Patriot missile they have, they could not stop any, most of this attack. So this show you a total failure. On one hand, you see a Yemeni army in Sana'a and Ansarullah, the Houthi, is getting stronger. And on the other hand, we see that the Saudi-backed forces is failing. They fighting each other. And as well, Saudi is failing to defend its border. They are using Yemeni and some mercenaries from Sudan to defend their border. And they begin this war, as they say, to protect their country. And now is exactly the opposite. There was no threat against Saudi Arabia, but now there is a huge threat against Saudi Arabia and as well against the existence of the Saudi royal family.
So Simon Mabon in Lancaster, how is it that, as Hussein points out, the Saudi Arabian military, with its money and with its hardware, is not able to repel these attacks? My layman's view of the situation thinks that the Saudis should be able to contain this sort of thing.
Yeah, you'd think, but I guess the nature of the conflict in Yemen means that traditional military approaches to conflict are not going to be applicable. There's no very clear battlefield away from urban spaces, and that makes it really difficult for the Saudis to combat the threat posed by the Houthis, which is one of the reasons why we've seen such devastation in Yemeni cities and Yemeni urban areas, as the Saudis have tried to curtail that threat posed by the Houthis. But it's, of course, had a devastating impact on the people of Yemen, on Yemeni society, as we've seen, as we've heard in all these various reports that have documented the devastation that's emerged from the coalition. So it's really difficult. I mean, it's nigh on impossible for the Saudis to stop someone hiding in the streets of a city and then launching a missile. So it's really difficult for the Saudis to stop this. In spite of all of their vast technological capabilities, it's incredibly difficult to know where all the individuals are who might be involved in this and then stop individual actions.
And now, to add to that, you've got the situation of Saudi Arabia starting to maybe lose some support from its closest ally. Rami Khouri, let me bring you in on this one. What is the UAE up to at the moment? Drawing down its forces and, shock of all shocks, talking to Iran as well.
I think the UAE is really reacting to a series of developments that are taking place simultaneously. The most important one probably is they have started to realize, which they did about a year ago when they started to really turn over the fighting to the troops, the 90,000 Yemenis and others that they've trained in the southern part of Yemen mostly. They realized that they're actually quite incompetent at warfare in other Arab countries. The Saudis and the Emiratis are very daring, very bold, very ambitious, very boastful of their capabilities and their will to defend themselves, but really heroically incompetent at doing it when they're fighting in another country. And I think the Emiratis have to be given credit for realizing that and saying, look, we better get out of here, especially when the American Congress is passing majority votes to prevent American sales of arms to the Emiratis and the Saudis. And second of all, you've got the Europeans now, the Germans, the French, and others, who are refusing to get involved with the American call to get an armada of international navies to preserve free movement through the Strait of Hormuz. The siege of Qatar has not worked at all. So the Emiratis are really getting terrible press all over the world. So I think they're starting to turn around their policy and realize that what they've tried to do, as they say, to push back the Iranians, has totally backfired and has increased Iranian influence in Yemen and other parts of the region. So it's really all of those things happening at the same time, and it's one of the few times, I think, where we can say the Emirati leadership is acting quite sensibly in realizing that its policies are not working and trying to turn them around.
Is it not a big risk, though, Rami, in incurring the wrath of Saudi Arabia for going against them?
Well, they really don't have much choice. The Saudis are going to have to do something similar. And the answer to all this, of course, is if you really are worried about the Iranians, most of the accusations they make about Iran are exaggerated, but there are some genuine concerns that people have with Iran, Arabs and foreigners and others. But if you are concerned, then the way to deal with them is the way that Obama did, which is negotiate with them and come to an agreement. So I think what we're starting to see with the Emirati move to talk about fishing and maritime stuff, they're now starting to explore the waters for a negotiated process rather than a military one and sanctions and all that. The only answer in that region is a regional security framework that all of the Arab countries and Iran and maybe a few others work on together. And the Saudis have to be a part of that process too.
Hussein, how do you think the Houthis will view this sort of pullback, if you like, from the United Arab Emirates? I'm sure they'd be pleased with it, but also maybe a bit suspicious. I mean, after 4 years of war and suddenly they decide, oh, okay, maybe this isn't working, we're going to get out.
Yeah, I think this is, they look at it as suspicious, and I believe that attack on yesterday on Al-Jala base, because those forces, they're backed by United Arab Emirates, and it's a clear message to United Arab Emirates that is not about your own troops, is about the troops that you have recruited, the militia that you have created in Aden, where we know that United Arab Emirates, all the forces that's backed by them in the south, they don't even recognize the so-called legitimacy. They don't allow the government to go to work from Aden, and I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that the United Arab Emirates has done, because they only focus on controlling Socotra Island, Bab el-Mandab Strait, and some key island in the Red Sea. But on the other hand, they haven't given a good example. If they have, for example, from the beginning when they have invaded Aden, if they have brought back the so-called legitimacy to Aden, made security really safe there, help the people to rebuild the country, I think they could have actually made a good example to bargain about. But they did exactly the opposite, because they don't want anything for Yemen, only to stay fighting each other and to control the main key area, as I mentioned, the island and the west coast. And I believe that many Yemenis now have realized, and I just want to mention that the top commander that was killed yesterday in that attack in Aden, he called Abu Yamama. He was the right-hand man of the United Arab Emirates in setting up secret prison, torture, assassination, abducting many Yemeni civilians, and most of them, they are allied to United Arab Emirates, like from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they show you that the United Arab Emirates actually doesn't want to help Yemenis, but they want actually to reach their interest in Yemen only.
Simon Mabon, let's bring you back in at this point. The other issue I mentioned is the fact that the United Arab Emirates not only drawing down, but talking to Iran. Yes, they were talking to Iran about the Strait of Hormuz, which is technically it's another issue. It's a big issue for the Gulf. But the fact that they're talking, A, why are they doing it? And B, how is Saudi Arabia going to react to its ally heading across the strait and talking to Tehran?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue and a really delicate moment for now. I think to understand, we need to go back to Yemen. We need to go back to the Emirati involvement in Yemen. And one of the reasons for that was to counter Iran, was to prevent Iran from getting a foothold on the Arabian Peninsula. But of course, that came at a massive price. And recently, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UAE has made several remarks about the expense of the Emirati engagement in Yemen, costing millions every day, hundreds of millions a day. And he's asking, to what extent are we getting anything back for this? So there's an economic dimension. We know that the Emirates has struggled. We know that tourism has dropped dramatically. So there's an economic dimension there. And that economic dimension is sitting against this security debate about how best to curtail Iranian influence across the region. And this goes back to what Rami was saying about dialogue. I think the Emirates have realized that perhaps the best way of addressing this Iranian question is through dialogue. I think as well that they're using this as a moment to test the waters. They were a little bit concerned about the Trump policy, which is seemingly to push for regime change in Tehran, whereas the Emirates want a form of policy change. They were concerned that the sanctions were getting tighter and tighter with little scope for dialogue and diplomacy. So this is an opportune moment for the Emirates to test the water, to see what scope there is for dialogue, what scope there is to actually improve relations across the Gulf. Now, Saudi Arabia is obviously going to be a little bit concerned about this. We know that the Saudis have got a long-standing rivalry with Iran. It just depends as to whether there has been a degree of communication between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, whether MBS, the Crown Prince, has given permission or at least acknowledged that it's okay for the Emirates to reach out to Tehran and see what the climate is like, whether there is scope for dialogue. If that hasn't happened, then it could well be that we start to see real tensions emerging between the Saudis and the Emiratis. Of course, if it has happened, then we could see a bit of a sea change and we could see emerging scope and possibility for dialogue between the various rivals.
Rami, do you suspect that is the case, that Mohammed bin Salman has been speaking to the Emiratis and saying, OK, you can do this? Because, again, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I just keep thinking about the potential blowback there could be for the UAE for going ostensibly against Saudi Arabia.
The UAE definitely has been consulting with Saudi Arabia, talking about these issues. They don't necessarily need to get a total green light. I mean, Saudi Arabia doesn't control the UAE. In fact, it's the other way around. Most observers who know the area well think that it's the UAE leadership that has influenced the Saudi leadership on some of these reckless and totally failed adventures in Qatar and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen. And maybe Libya even now too. So the likelihood is they are consulting with each other. They have to work closely together. The Emiratis and the Saudi leaderships, about 2011, when the Arab uprisings broke out and you started getting elections and Jazeera was all over the place and greater than ever with people hearing real journalism, free expression all over the place, elections, Muslim Brothers winning the presidency in Egypt. That's when the Emiratis and the Saudis freaked out and they decided we've got to put a stop to all of this. And they came up with their strategy and it has been a total failure. So they have to stick together because their fates are really intertwined. I would just add another point. The Emiratis are not totally abandoning Yemen. They're pulling out most of their troops from direct fighting, but they're still funding and arming and training and equipping 100,000 and more troops. They've still got alliances with various people like Tariq Saleh, the nephew of the former president. They're still making deals with people, tribal leaders and others. And they still control certain areas, including Socotra Island and others. So they want to keep a strategic foothold there because it's part of their whole regional plan to be able to have ports and facilities all across the Red Sea, even going up into Libya they would try one day to do. But this is not going to work. They can't. This is way beyond their capabilities as a small little country. And I think we're starting to see the first signs of that realism in Emirati foreign policy.
Yeah, good point to make there. You know something, gentlemen? I have a question on my list here, one of the last questions. Or a bullet point, if you like, saying, is it sort of the beginning of the end of the coalition? I'm going to change that now because I think from listening to all three of you, you've all talked about dialogue. And I'd like to get your thoughts, Simon. I'll start with you, then I'll come to Hussein and Rami. Your thoughts on what dialogue might look like. Because after you've had 4 years of war, after you've had tens of thousands of people killed, it's difficult to sit around a table and suddenly start talking about peace. You should want to talk about peace, but it's a difficult thing.
Yeah, it is. And dialogue has to go hand in hand with trust. You need trust to have a serious dialogue, but you also need dialogue to have trust. You need to build that trust. That trust takes time. As you say, it's difficult to trust someone when you've been on opposing sides of a conflict, when you've had a long period of time of hating that person, of dehumanizing that person through being on the other side of a conflict. So you have to build that trust. You have to rehumanize. You have to start to empathize with their grievances. You have to be aware of the issues that are at play. And this applies equally to the Yemen conflict, but also to tensions between the Saudis, Emiratis, and the Iranians and others. You have to have empathy. You have to build trust. That comes through dialogue. That comes through signaling trust. And once you've got that trust, you can start to have more serious dialogue. But you have to have a degree of dialogue to build the trust. So it's a cyclical process. It's a slow, difficult process, but it's absolutely essential to actually make things better, to get conflict resolved.
Hussein, with your knowledge of the Houthis and their situation, do you think they would be open to dialogue? Under what conditions would they come to the table?
Yes, I believe they have been open for dialogue from the beginning. They have went to Tehran, al-Janub in Saudi Arabia, to Kuwait, to all negotiation. But I think to be successful in any dialogue, there should be a dialogue between all Yemeni parties. We should put the so-called legitimacy aside, because Hadi, he was a president of a transition period, and he have no power over Yemen. And I mean, the Saudis using him as a tool. So a direct talk between Yemeni parties, and as well there should be a direct talk between Ansarullah the Houthi and between Saudi Arabia. If they are not going to do that, then we're going to see another Stockholm agreement, which now been obstructed by the Saudi-backed forces, even though Ansarullah the Houthi, under the supervision of UN, has withdrawn from the three-port. That's why we don't want to repeat that. Direct dialogue, a total ceasefire, and Ansarullah the Houthi has offered many times that they will stop attacking Saudi Arabia using drone and ballistic missile. This was days before the Stockholm agreement, and they stopped that for about 7 months. And Saudi has not even replied to that request from Sana'a. That's why I think Saudi, they should just put everything aside and sit directly and talk with our leadership here in Sana'a.
We'll leave the final word with Rami Khouri. Rami, Hussein mentioned there in passing Stockholm, the Stockholm Agreement or the Stockholm talks. Is that where it could go back to as a starting point for any future talks, any future dialogue from all parties?
Well, the internal situation in Yemen started as an internal situation. The various wars and separation and unity and civil wars and all these negotiations for a new constitution, these things have gone on in Yemen for about 30 years now, and they're quite incredible in their scope. And then you got, and always the Saudis were involved, and then you got the Emiratis involved, and it became a regional conflict, and the Emirati Saudis saying we want to push back Iran. So it kind of got blown out of proportion. There has to be a process to stop the fighting inside Yemen, and that can come simultaneously with any beginning of a regional dialogue, or it come before, it could come after. That's for the Yemenis to decide themselves, and they will find a way to do this. There's serious issues. The people in the south really don't like being ruled by people from the north and the Houthis and others, but they have to figure this out, and they will. But there is something really important going on. The Emiratis in their talks in Iran started the talks a few days ago about fishing boats. So then they started talking about the free passage of shipping. So they have to pick one or two items, go one at a time, agree on something, make sure that both sides see themselves as having equal rights. Everybody can fish, everybody can export oil, everybody can trade, and that's how this process will finally expand. And then you've got to get some sensible people, certainly not from Washington, because there aren't very many there, but sensible people from around the world who can expand this into a real serious regional process, maybe under the UN's auspices.
Rami Khouri joining us from Beirut. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Also, Hussein al-Baqaiti, in Sana'a and Simon Maybon in Lancaster. Thank you to all three of you. And as ever, thank you for watching. 3 ways to check us out online. One is the show section at aljazeera.com, where you can see this program or indeed any of our previous editions. You can also find us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, on Twitter at AJ Inside Story, and I'm at Kamal AJE if you want to get in touch with me directly. From the whole Inside Story team, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.